Hello everyone. Today in chapter number 3, human reproduction, we are going to study following 3 subtopics, that is oogenesis, follicular development and structure of ovum. Let's start. Female reproductive system consists of a pair of ovaries present on either side of the uterus. Ovaries are the primary sex gland because they produce female gamete, that is ovum. And they also secrete female sex hormone estrogen and progesterone, which are responsible for development of female secondary sexual characters at puberty. Now the process by which the ovaries they form egg, that process is known as oogenesis. So we can define oogenesis as the process of production of egg cells taking place in ovaries of females. In case of females, oogenesis begins in the fetal life, that is before birth, under the influence of maternal sex hormone. In oogenesis, the diploid germ cells which are there, they undergo meiosis to produce haploid ovum. Now let's study oogenesis in detail. Oogenesis involves 3 phases. First phase is known as mitotic differentiation. The cells which undergo oogenesis, they are oogonia. During the fetal life, in the female ovary, 1 to 2 million oogonias are present or formed. These oogonia, they undergo mitotic differentiation and they produce diploid primary oocyte. These primary oocyte then enters the second phase of oogenesis, which is known as growth phase. So they grow in size. Now, after that, the third phase is maturation phase, where the primary oocyte, it divides by meiosis. So primary oocyte enters meiosis 1, and in meiosis 1, during prophase 1, its division is arrested. It cannot continue the division. So at the time of birth, the female ovaries, they contain primary oocyte. Now, after birth, the ovaries of the female, they stop receiving hormones. Their body doesn't produce sex hormones. So the period from birth to puberty, many of the primary oocytes, they are degenerating. So at puberty, when the female sex organs are mature, the ovaries receive hormone from the pituitary gland, and the primary oocyte, every month, one primary oocyte completes its maturation phase. So it completes its first meiotic division and results in the formation of 2 unequal cells. The larger one is known as secondary oocyte and the smaller one is known as polar body. Polar body does not play any role in sexual reproduction and it later on degenerates. In humans, this first polar body, it does not undergo second meiotic division. The secondary oocyte then enters into meiosis 2 and its division is arrested at metaphase 2 of meiosis 2. At this stage, ovum is released from the ovary during ovulation. Now, when it is going to complete its second meiotic division? So, as the sperm approaches the secondary oocyte and fertilizes it, the entry of sperm into the secondary oocyte stimulates its division and it completes its second meiotic division and forms the mature ovum and second polar body. So, this is how oogenesis is taking place in female ovary. Now let's see what changes are taking place in the ovary. So inside the ovary, folliculogenesis is taking place, that is the development of follicles. This diagram represents the TS of ovary. Inside the ovary, there are several follicles present which are undergoing growth, and the mature follicle is then releasing the ovum. Okay, so first of all, the ovary is lined with single layer of epithelium known as germinal epithelium. Below germinal epithelium, there is a layer of loose connective tissue known as tunica albuginea. Inside tunica albuginea, there is present stroma. This entire space is stroma. The stroma is divided into two regions. The outer region is called cortex and the middle part is known as medulla. In the medulla, there are present several blood vessels and nerve fibers. Some of the cells of the germinal epithelium, they start proliferating into the cortex of the ovary and they multiply by mitosis to form diploid oogonia. Now these oogonia then divide by mitosis to form primary oocyte. Now the primary oocyte, it gets surrounded with flat granulosa cell. This structure, which contains primary oocyte and surrounding which the granulosa cells are there, it is known as primordial follicle. This is the initial stage of ovarian follicle. The primordial follicle further grows and its flat granulosa cell, now they become cuboidal in shape. And this stage of ovarian follicle is known as primary follicle. So, during the fetal life, these are the stages which are achieved by the ovarian follicles during the fetal life. Now, after birth, there are 1 to 2 million primary follicles present in the ovary of the female. Now, from birth to the puberty, in the transition period which is there, during that, many of the primary follicles, they degenerate, and that process is known as follicular atresia. So, at the beginning of the puberty, there are only 60,000 to 80,000 primary follicles left in each ovary of the female. Now these follicles, under the influence as the female attains puberty, the brain of the female, it is having a part known as hypothalamus. That hypothalamus produces a hormone known as GnRH, that is gonadotropin releasing hormone. It stimulates through blood, it reaches pituitary gland and it stimulates the anterior lobe of pituitary to produce gonadotropins, which are FSH and LH. FSH and LH, they acts on the ovary of the female and this stimulates the growth of the ovarian follicles. So, the primary follicle grows and it gets converted into secondary follicle. What changes are taking place? The single layer of cuboidal granulosa cell, it multiplies and it forms multiple layers of granulosa cell. These layers together termed as stratum granulosum. They get surrounded with a layer of stromal cells and this layer is known as theca folliculi. This stage of ovarian follicle is known as secondary follicle. Secondary follicle further grows under the influence of hormone FSH and LH to form tertiary follicle. What changes we notice here? In the stratum granulosum, some small fluid-filled cavities appear. These cavities are known as antrum. And the second change which is taking place is theca folliculi, it differentiates and form two layers, that is theca externa, the exterior one, and theca interna, the interior one. So, if we look at secondary follicle and tertiary follicle, we see two major differences. One is the tertiary follicle is having antrum, which is absent in the secondary follicle. Secondary follicle, is having a single layer of theca folliculi, which in tertiary follicle get differentiated into two layers, that is theca externa and theca interna. Now, till here the ovum is at primary oocyte stage. So, when the secondary follicle changes into tertiary follicle, the primary oocyte present inside the secondary follicle, it completes its first meiotic division and forms the secondary oocyte. The tertiary follicle further matures and forms the final matured follicle known as Graafian follicle. So the small antrums which were present in the tertiary follicle, they fuses and they forms a large cavity that is known as antrum, and it is filled with a liquid. A fluid is present in this cavity which is known as Leaker folliculi. The enlarged antrum divides the stratum granulosum into two regions. The one which is immediately surrounding the ovum is known as cumulus oophorus, and the other part which surrounds the antrum is known as membrana granulosa. Graafian follicle is the mature follicle. All these follicular stages, all these ovarian follicle, as they grow, they produce estrogen. Maximum estrogen is produced by the Graafian follicle. Now, the ovum inside the Graafian follicle is at secondary oocyte stage. Okay. So, the Graafian follicle then ruptures and releases the secondary oocyte. This process is known as ovulation, and it is controlled mainly by the pituitary hormone LH. This process is known as ovulation. LH also converts the ruptured follicle into a yellow body, an endocrine body, which is known as corpus luteum. Corpus luteum produces the second female sex hormone, that is progesterone, which is also known as pregnancy maintaining hormone because it is important for maintaining the pregnancy. Within 10 days, if the implantation has not taken place, the corpus luteum degenerates and it forms a white mass known as corpus albicans. So that is the end of one complete cycle. Again, in the next female reproductive cycle, a new follicle will start its development. So this is how the follicle development is taking place inside the ovary. Now let's study the structure of ovum which is released from the ovary. The ovum released is at secondary oocyte stage and it contains a haploid nucleus. Surrounding the nucleus, the cytoplasm which is there, it is known as ooplasm. Outer to ooplasm, there is present plasma membrane, and outer to plasma membrane is present another membrane known as vitellin membrane. The space between the plasma membrane and vitellin membrane is known as perivitellin space. Outer to vitellin membrane is present a non-cellular layer known as zona pellucida, this green color one. Attached to zona pellucida, there are present elongated granulosa cells known as corona radiata cell. This diagram is also asked in the exam for 2 marks. So, students, you must practice this diagram. So, we completed 3 important topics, that is oogenesis, follicular development and structure of female gamete. If you like my video, please subscribe my channel and hit the like button. Thank you. In the next class, we will study about female reproductive cycle.